I was in a hospital room at Seattle Children's when one of my patients, who had been battling cancer for 4 years and it wasn't looking good, said to me, "Michelle, are you going to tell my story after I'm gone?" I said, "Mandy, I would be honored to if you want me to." She said, "Oh, I want you to. I want people to know that my life counted. You know, Michelle, I have this really, really strange and unusual form of cancer, and the doctors are allowing me to participate in so many clinical trials, and they're learning so many things that are going to help other children so they don't have to suffer like I have." And as she was saying that, I could see a glow in her face. Why? Because she had found her purpose in the midst of her pain. And so a few weeks later, when her mother called me and said, "Michelle, Mandy knows she's terminal. She wants to participate in yet another clinical trial. It's only going to be painful for her. I don't want her to do it. She's fighting me on this, but she loves you. Can you talk to her?" And I sat there and I thought about what she had said to me. And I said, "You know what, Mandy's mom? I can't do that. Because your daughter has created a purpose for her life, a story that is allowing her to navigate the most difficult things of all at 11 years old, 4 years of this, and to ask her to not fulfill her narrative to the very end is to dishonor the story that she's created. So I'm so sorry. I cannot do that." And to her mother's credit, she did sign the papers. She did participate in the trial. And 2 months later, she left us. I learned a lot from Mandy. I learned a lot from the patients at Children's. I had founded the storytelling residency program there. But I didn't start there. About 40 years ago, because I've been at this for a long time, I was meditating in the backyard, and what came to me was a globe with hands holding up the globe. They were my hands. And over the top were the words, "Peace through story." I had absolutely no idea what that meant. But it was so strong, and it reverberated through my body to such an extent that I quit my job and stepped out as a professional storyteller. Now, I wasn't unfamiliar with the power of story. As a child growing up in Alaska, I had loved reading and loved books and had a very chaotic home life. So for me, stories were a balm, a way of kind of nurturing me in the midst of the chaos. But I also had been a former director of Children's Public Library Services, and I had also used story effectively to raise $2.8 million for the School of International Studies at the University of Washington, a campaign that we had just successfully completed. But this was different. This was asking me to step out into the unknown to see what would happen. And I can assure you that when my spouse at the time was not happy with that decision, we had made decisions based on 2 incomes. And I remembered saying to him, "If I do not do this, I will regret this for the rest of my life. So if we need to divorce right now, then let's do it. Because I have to go do whatever this is." And I had to find out, what does it mean to find peace through story? It was so vague. So I started out by storytelling in schools. And I remembered I was doing an after-school storytelling class. And little Erica was one of the children in 5th grade, and she had cerebral palsy. So she kind of made her way up to the front of the room, and some of the children snickered a bit, not out of unkindness, I think, but out of embarrassment for her. And when she got her balance, she looked into the eyes of every person sitting there, and then she started to tell her story. And what story did she choose to tell? Beauty and the Beast. And she told it with so much passion. We could feel the jealousy of the sisters and the anguish of the father having to leave her behind in the forest. And when she finished, there was silence. Reverent silence. And then the children began to give feedback because that was our process. And so one of the children said, "Oh, I really like the sound of your voice." And another child said, "I really like the pictures that you painted in my mind." And the third child said, "I really like the way that you moved." Oh? Because you see, in the telling of that story, they saw not her disability, but her ability for the very first time. And she saw her ability for the very first time. That she had a gift, something that she could express and share and would be able to make her life even richer. And I was in a position of helping to facilitate that. There's a wonderful line in a book called Crow and Weasel by Barry Lopez that says, "When stories come to you, care for them and give them away when they're needed. Sometimes people need stories more than food to stay alive. That's why we put stories in one another's memory." And so for the last 40 years, I have traveled the world, 15 years from the education side. And then during that time, I woke up from a dream that I was to go to the former Soviet Union and build bridges of peace between our countries using storytelling. And when I went there in 1984, I had an opportunity to tell stories in an English-speaking school in Moscow. And afterward, the children came up to me and they said, "Oh, Michale, Gabriel," they said, "would you come back to the Soviet Union? Would you bring more stories inside of your head? And would you bring children to help tell them?" And I said, yes, having absolutely no idea how I could make that happen. What I discovered in that experience came in many different ways. I took young storytellers there and teachers there, did a film series for Soviet National Television that reached 50 million people. But I remember getting a note from a child saying, "You have taken me to the land of fairy tales and left me there, facing my own dreams and feelings. And I am so much better for it." Or the teacher who said, "Listening to these stories today, Michale, I had forgotten why I had gotten into education. I've been so busy doing administrative stuff that I forgot the reason I'm here is to touch a child's life and to make a difference." Now, people have said to me, "Has it been a difficult journey?" And I would say to you, yes, it has. There have been times when I would look at the number of bookings I had and I didn't know how I was going to pay my rent, especially after I divorced. There are times when I would be in a fetal position in my bed, and what I would discover I needed to do was to put my feet on the floor, stand up, and take an action, because I needed to support what I was being called to do. And there have been numerous challenges over the year. Would I trade my life for anything else? Absolutely not, because I'll tell you why. When a person connects with the deep story within them, which is what I do now with my coaching and consulting work, and they're able to see who they are in a much bigger picture, and then with my background, I can storytell back to them their story as I'm hearing it. It's like, "Oh my God, that's me? Yeah, that's you." And when you're able to thread all of those disparate pieces of your life back into a cohesive whole, it allows you to live your life with a greater sense of passion and purpose, because you're connected. You're connected to yourself. You're connected to what matters to you. I remember there was a gentleman, I told this story at the Boeing Company. I worked with leadership programs for 27 years. And he had only learned to read and write 3 years before through an adult literacy program at a school in Seattle. He entrusted me with his story. I interviewed him several times. And I stood up on a stage and told that story. And there were 200 senior vice presidents and CEO of the Boeing company. They were raising $26 million for the employee fund. And I had a dual challenge because in interviewing Bill, I could see how much pain he had had from being dyslexic, from not being able to read and write, for his being bullied and being thrown into a coat closet in 3rd grade because he couldn't do the work with the rest of the children. And then what it was like for him to have to say to his boss, I cannot do what's being asked here. He said, I can't capture what people are saying on a whiteboard because I can't write what they're saying. And he figured he was out of Boeing. We're talking 17 years. And his boss said to him, Bill, I have a son with the exact same problem that you have. He's dyslexic. And so I'm going to not ask you to go to the whiteboard, but on the first day that your team meets, I want you to tell them your story. Because he said, Bill, we're trying really hard with the Boeing company to think outside of the box, and you have been thinking outside of the box your entire life. When I finished his story, I had the lights brought up, and he had him stand, holding the hand of a diminutive grandmother, the director of the Hamlin Robinson School, wearing the first suit and nice shoes he'd ever worn in his life. But the most important thing for me afterward was he said to me, Michelle, I have never been proud of my life. I've never been proud of me. I've never seen myself as having a talent or skills or capacities, but the way you told my story, I now can claim my life and claim my story. So here's what I would say to all of you. The most important thing that we can do is to tell our story, but you know the second most important thing is to be a good listener. Because what happens so often, especially today, someone starts to tell their story and someone says, oh, that reminds me of, and that story gets lost and that voice is silenced. And when a voice is silenced, that wisdom that that person has to bring to the table is lost as well. And so if you and I can just take that time to say to somebody, tell me about yourself, and then say, tell me more, so that they can open up and dig a little deeper into their own story to find nuggets of truth and wisdom and insight and courage and resilience that they didn't even know that they had. I am now 78 years old. My days are numbered. And I have only one thing to do in life now, because I've gotten very clear. I've looked at my entire life and I said, what are the moments that brought me the greatest joy, the greatest sense of purpose, the greatest sense of making a difference? And it is when I've been able to work with people and help them tell their story and create sacred spaces where their story can be received. Because when that happens, we change the world. And when that happens, we found peace through story.